Welcome. You're listening to Latin Waves with your hosts, Sylvia and Sylvia Richardson. Latin Waves is more than just hot rhythms. This is a show about community, about creating a culture that is inclusive and based on fairness. Because everyone deserves dignity, respect, and has something to contribute. A new world is possible, and it all starts with us. I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Robert Jensen, Emeritus Professor in the School of Journalism and Media at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a prolific author and one of my favorite people to talk to. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, Sylvia, it's always great to talk.
You know, since we last spoke, the world seems to have been upside down. You know, the fear of pandemic seems to be corrosive and ubiquitous. Everywhere you look, people are terrified. And sadly, I think this cascade of catastrophes we're living with, be it pandemic fear or fires, as it is the case here in British Columbia, it seems to be endemic everywhere. So I was very relieved when I learned about your book, The Restless and Relentless Mind of Wes Jackson, Searching for Sustainability. Can we talk a little bit about how that title came about?
Sure. Wes Jackson is well known within the sustainable agriculture and environmental movements, but not so well known outside of that. So listeners may not recognize his name. He was a Kansas farm boy turned professor who left academic work to found an alternative school back in the 1970s. It was called the Land Institute in Kansas in Midwest America. The alternative school also morphed eventually into a research institution, and at the Land Institute, they're still doing some pretty exciting research on perennial grains. It's a complicated and complex, often beyond my scientific ability, but the idea is that by growing perennials instead of annuals, we can plow less, the soil will be healthier. It's a long and important story. But Wes founded that place back in '76 and has been going ever since. He's retired from running the place day to day. I chose the title, The Restless and Relentless Mind of Wes Jackson, to capture, I think, a spirit that we all need. Wes is one of those guys who just doesn't know how to sit still, even at 85. You can't keep him down. And he kind of gravitates toward questions that don't have easy answers, might not have answers at all. He gravitates toward problems that don't have easy solutions. And I think that's the kind of spirit we need, to not give up in the face of real challenges. And Wes's life is sort of an indication of that. He'll tell you that if you go back to the late 60s and early 70s when the environmental movement in the United States was just taking off, he was pretty much convinced it was all over. He didn't see a way out, and he didn't expect to be around this long. Well, it didn't play out exactly that way. He would say we still have really deep environmental and social challenges that aren't going to be solved easily. But he's a really joyful character. He faces down these tough questions, but has a very loving spirit. And I think that's, kind of what we're after here. And so young people have great ideas, and young people are the engine of social change. But our elders are repositories of wisdom as well. And the book is really an attempt to capture the wisdom of this one particular elder.
It's important that we recognize what an elder is. So can you explain a little what that means to you?
Yeah, well, I always say elders aren't just old people. I've known a lot of old people I wouldn't, follow around the corner because their lives are a testimony to bad judgment, selfishness, greed, all sorts of things. So simply getting old doesn't make you an elder. I think, at least to me, an elder is someone who has proved trustworthy, someone whose counsel we can rely on. Now, that doesn't mean elders are always right. In fact, I think the greatest elders are the ones who point out their mistakes as much as their successes, because, Wes is 85 years old. Nobody lives to 85 without making a whole lot of mistakes along the way, bad judgments, getting things wrong. So to me, elders are a place to look not only for insight into how the world works, but as a reminder of humility, that, none of us has the whole answer. If we're lucky, we might get a little part of the answer somewhere.
I love that. And, one of the things I love about you is that you always have a way of combining real life applicability of terms. And for me, critical theory in general, I think of Paul Freire, and it's more about asking when we're researching something, is asking how will this serve society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Will it do
Sure.
more harm than good? It's not just about finding information for information's sake, but rather trying to find solutions to ongoing problems.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about
Yeah.
creating a sustainable world, what are we sustaining? Is it business as usual, or?
Let me go back. You mentioned Paulo Freire, who, of course, the incredible educator, thinker, radical from Brazil. And you were implicitly saying, well, those are the elders we need to look at, not necessarily people who come out of the universities. And I heard it, Sylvia. You were trying to criticize all these highfalutin university professors who use big words. And I'm not going to let you get away with it. Well, actually, I agree completely with that. I spent, 30 years in academic life, and I really developed an incredible distaste for people who tried to develop knowledge that didn't have a direct application to the world, and who hid behind theory, in the kind of negative sense of that, who hid behind jargon. And I think you're absolutely right, and I'm going to press that because I think the universities, not only in the United States and North America, around the world, generate incredible knowledge, but it has to be directed toward human flourishing and ecological health. And if it isn't, then I'm not much interested in it. And that's another reason I really admire Wes. He had a kind of cushy academic job, and he gave it up. He gave it up to found a new institution with no guarantee it would even last a year. And I think that kind of risk-taking and courage, I'll call it courage, is really important. So I'm foursquare behind this kind of cynicism. Yeah. Well, the status quo is over. Now, not everybody would agree with that, of course, but I'm talking as a matter of practical reality. A high-energy, high-technology, mass consumption world. And, of course, most of that consumption goes on in the first world and the developed world, but it's an idea that is spread everywhere. And in parts of the developing world, you will see this kind of obsession with energy, technology, consumption. Okay, well, that's over. Obviously, it's still going on today. Obviously, Wall Street is still there. But as a matter of practical reality, it cannot continue indefinitely because it's drawing down the ecological capital of the planet. Even before you get to questions of equity and social justice, this is simply an unsustainable system. And, it stands to reason an unsustainable system can't be sustained forever. Now, we don't know the details of how long this is going to go on, but we can be reasonably certain it's going to change, if not within my lifetime, certainly within my child's lifetime, I think. Okay, so it's not business as usual, because business as usual is kind of a death cult. The most recent system is capitalism. But, we've had unsustainable economic and political systems throughout, basically the last 5, 6, 7,000 years of world history. The Roman Empire was not sustainable. It was based on a constant need to acquire new territory and new resources, and eventually it collapsed. So that's the reality. So what do we do? Well, some people talk about, revolutionary movements that will displace capitalism and bring in a new world order. I've lived long enough to be a little skeptical about the possibility or even the wisdom of that. But there's always small-scale experiments at the local level that you try to bring together, share knowledge, and perhaps influence policy at the local level, the provincial or state level, maybe the national level, and maybe eventually the international level. If I had a recipe for how to make sense of all this, I would, have it up on the web and be touting it, but I don't think anybody has such a recipe. So we struggle in the movements and in the day-to-day projects that make sense to us. I think that's the best we can do in some sense. And if enough people do that, well, then social change is possible. If people abandon that, well, then there really is not much hope.
I love that you have found Wes, who founded this beautiful organism called the Land Institute. Because I think in many ways, one of my favorite books about you was one on All My Bones Shake. You were talking about the 4 fundamentalisms, and one that I think we're really stuck on is this idea that high energy technologies will save us.
Yeah.
And we keep toting different miracles, right? One that you note in your book with Wes is that 1909 miracle of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. And I wonder if you could tell the story and why this blind obedience to fundamentalisms can lead us astray and sometimes to our own death.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all familiar with religious fundamentalism and the threat that poses. We point out national fundamentalism, a kind of hyper-patriotism, is incredibly dangerous. It's now common, at least on the left, to talk about economic fundamentalism or market fundamentalism, this irrational commitment to capitalism. Well, Wes is actually the first person I heard use the term technological fundamentalism. He borrowed it from a friend of his. And it's a belief that all our problems will be solved by high energy, high technology. And what makes it so laughable is it includes the use of high energy, high technology to solve problems caused by previous technology. It's throwing, as they say, good money after bad. So we've got to break that, and I don't think there's any way around that. Now, you mentioned the crisis in the world in the early 20th century when organic sources of fertilizer were running out. Guano and things like this, there was only so much of that in the world. And a German chemist and a German engineer perfected something that is now called the Haber-Bosch process, and it allowed at an industrial scale the production of synthetic ammonia fertilizer. Now, people who know plant science know that nitrogen is a key ingredient to successful agriculture. So how do you produce synthetic nitrogen? Well, there's a lot of nitrogen in the air, but it doesn't just settle onto the ground in a way plants can use. Long story, the Haber-Bosch process has been responsible for the explosion of the human population in the 20th century. Some people estimate as much as 40, 45, maybe even 50% of the human population would not be alive without the Haber-Bosch process. Well, that's stunning. We have 8 billion people. We have a population level that can't be sustained probably at any level of consumption, let alone modern industrial consumption. So this story of one industrial process, a belief in technology that would solve our food crisis, has led to a world that is exhausted in ecological terms. The Haber-Bosch process has been called, the single most important advance in science and technology and human history, and so few of us really know about it. I didn't learn about it till I was much older. Well, that's the kind of history we need to know, and it means that if we're going to try and continue to produce food with industrial means, right, the so-called green revolution of the 1950s and 60s, for instance, we're going to go down the same road of drawing down the ecological capital of the planet beyond replacement levels for short-term success, but long-term disaster. And this is what Wes Jackson has always called the failure of success, where you can succeed in the short term and feel pretty good about it, but set the scene for a much larger failure in decades to come.
One of the things that I'm very aware now that I'm a grandmother is the beauty of simplicity, right? My granddaughter sees so much magic in little frogs. There is a marshland near where we live, and all the frogs were trying to migrate from the pond into this very into the tall weeds, right, to protect themselves because all the birds come and eat them. And I think of all the things that we affect just by the act of eating, by the act of agriculture, by the act of putting poisons on our weeds to get rid of weeds, right? All of the things that we're killing on a daily basis that go unnoticed. And in so many ways, it shouldn't surprise us because, we don't even notice when other people are being displaced, made homeless,
Yeah.
be it indigenous people, black people, or people of color, you know. And so how do we break out of that trance? Because in so many ways, perhaps we've been domesticated by colonialism to look at the world, to normalize injustice, to normalize violence, to normalize this death culture that you're speaking of. You're listening to Latin Waves. Our guest is Dr. Robert Jensen. Please visit our website, latinwavesmedia.com, and learn how to support our work by becoming a member for as little as $1 a month.
Yeah. It's funny, you mentioned being domesticated. A number of people pointed out that when we domesticated plants and animals back in the so-called agricultural revolution, 10, 12,000 years ago, those plants and animals also in some sense domesticated us, which just reminds us that we're not in charge. We're an organism among many. We're not capable of running the world in the way that, especially the modern scientific mind believes it can. Doesn't mean modern science is irrelevant or detrimental in all cases, of course. You're talking about shifting a focus, and I think that's really important. Let me just take one thing that happens when you kind of shift that frame of reference. You mentioned that we need to start living more simply, and that's certainly true. The modern industrial mind, especially with all this high energy, high technology, does seem to complicate the world. But in some sense, no matter what humans create, it's always going to be far more simplistic than the larger living world, than what we call nature. West points this out, that if you look at the relationships that maintain a prairie, and he lives in Kansas in the middle of the United States where it's prairie territory, well, there's an extraordinary complexity in nature that sustains all of those plants, animals, that keeps that soil healthy. Now, nobody's in charge of organizing all of that because no human being could organize that kind of complexity. So, we tend to look at, let's say, a piece of prairie and say, well, that's pretty simple. And Wes would say just the opposite. There is complexity. There is an incredible amount of information in all of those organisms. And human beings can never match that. Right? And that's just a way of kind of flipping the usual frame of reference to help us see the world differently. In that case, protecting the prairie is far more important than, protecting any human invention. And as Wes would say, we're far better off investing our future in trying to be as much like the prairie as we can when we farm, instead of trying to make a farm, look like an industrial factory. Well, a lot of people from a lot of different traditions have made these kind of points. And I think it's important to realize that when we think about how to go forward, we want to pull on the common themes from all the different traditions. And as you pointed out, of course, a lot of traditions have been marginalized, minimized, or literally destroyed, especially indigenous traditions. So, the coming together of the insights from all of these different perspectives, I think, is the only way we have a fighting chance as a species to be around when your grandchild, comes of age. And I do think the stakes are really that high.
One of the things that I want to bring us back to is if we are thinking about the questions that don't have answers, those are the scary ones. And yet that's exactly where we need to go, right? Because we've been told that at 8 billion people, we have enough for everyone's needs, but not enough for everyone's greed. And so if that is the case, if we are able to sustain, the lives, to me, that question ensues, well, at what kind of consumption? And you talk in your book about scale and scope, and I wonder if you could say more about that.
Well, I agree that today, with the agricultural system we have, there is enough food to feed 8 billion people. If there were, just an equitable distribution of wealth, that's true enough. But I don't think that's true indefinitely. So while we could feed the entire world today, we are not going to be able to feed the entire world if it has a population of 8, or as it's predicted to go to 9 or 10 billion, into the indefinite future, even into the short-term future. Because, as I said, we are drawing down the ecological capital of the planet at dramatically faster than replacement levels. I think that's the ultimate question as Wes would say, that goes beyond the available answers, and it's the ultimate problem that goes beyond available solutions. And this is, in a new manuscript Wes and I are working on, one of the things we take on, the fact that people, not surprisingly, have a hard time asking that question or trying to formulate solutions for a world not with 8 billion people, but with a truly sustainable human population into the future. And if you ask me, well, what is the exact level of human population that's sustainable? Well, of course, I can't tell you. One is because, as you point out, it depends on what level of consumption we're at. But it also depends on, so many contingencies that nobody can predict. In fact, it's the problems that we can't even imagine solutions to that we should be focused on, because, of course, with collective effort, eventually, we might imagine, if not solutions in some nice and tidy way, a path forward that will reduce human suffering and reduce further ecological degradation. Now, I'm not trying to sell a plan because I don't have a plan, but I think we have to collectively start engaging those kinds of questions.
One of the things that is very evident to me is that this pandemic, we're told we're all in the same boat. We're all in the boat together, And the reality is that we're not. Many people did not have spaces to isolate, as was the case with many members of my family. And, many people have suffered more losses than others. People lost jobs. People were forced to close their business. Meanwhile, big businesses were allowed to stay open to continue business as usual. So we're not in the same boat, and we're not all suffering the same consequences. What's your vision post-pandemic, and do you see a way out?
Well, I think it's really important to stress the point you just made, which is, yes, we're all in this together in the sense that every human being is at risk of the virus. But those risks were not apportioned equally across societies, obviously. The one that, as we argue politically in the United States, left, right, Republicans, Democrats, whatever, is we forget that most of the developing world is still struggling just to get, vaccines. We have a problem in the United States of enough vaccine, but too many people refusing to take it. Well, guess what? In most of the world, there isn't enough. And so that's a huge gap within developed societies like the U.S. and Canada. Of course, we all know about the disparities. And I live that every day. I'm retired, so I have a stable retirement income. I live with my spouse, and we don't have children at home that we had to try and educate online. Neither one of us had to worry about going to work. I mean, the stresses that so many other people were under, we did not feel. And I was aware of that every day I woke up. And there was, little that could be done about it in the short term. But that's the reality. When I think of stress, I think of this term they use in the banking industry, a stress test, which after the collapse of 2008, we were supposed to have stress tests to make sure banks could be solvent. Well, you could think about, the world having just gone through a really important stress test at which we failed at almost every turn. The first step toward trying to figure out how to go forward is to realize what isn't working. And that's hard enough in this country. And I'm not just in the U.S. pointing at, the Trumpers, the right-wing reactionaries. I mean, there's a whole lot of denial across society about what's really happening. What is that going to look like? Well, post-pandemic, first of all, we have to ask, is there going to be post-pandemic? Or is this now, as they like to say, a new normal? Are we going to be dealing with variations on the coronavirus that basically keep us in some form of, isolation, lockdown, measures that don't allow business as usual? In some ways, that's good. Going back to business as usual just accelerates the degradation of the ecosphere. But of course, human suffering is magnified during this. So, I would like to think that in times of stress, people come together and ask, what is the humane way to share what we have? And as you pointed out, to reduce what we expect. There's two ways to deal with the world. One is to constantly struggle to get more, and the other is to change your expectations. And it's not enough to do that personally. You know, I've tried to reduce my own consumption and have done some of that, but that's really not the point. The point is we have a society that's fueled by an obsession with growth and an obsession with gadgets. And growth and gadgets are not the future. Growth and gadgets, as we've been saying, are kind of the markers of a death cult at this point.
In many ways, you know, isolation has been very good for the business of empire. Your movement is restricted, and so it's been remarkable that we've seen the level of demonstrations for Black Lives Matter in the midst of pandemic. And so I think it speaks to our, as human beings, there is within us a desire to see a world with justice, to change our society.
Yeah. Your mention of Black Lives Matter is a reminder of how we can never predict the trajectory of change. So I was born in 1958. I lived through the civil rights movement and the initial kind of excitement about that, and then the disappointment. As you go into the 90s and the 2000s, it became increasingly clear, and I'll just speak of the United States here, the United States had not really renounced white supremacy. And in fact, not only polite liberal white supremacy, but a full-blown right-wing reactionary overt white supremacy surged back. And in the face of that, the Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, you know, you can go back to the American Indian movement, you know, all these efforts to challenge the system of domination and subordination, which had seemed to not make significant ground, all of a sudden surged. And I would be the first old guy to admit that I would have never predicted the last couple of years in the United States. It doesn't mean, of course, you know, the struggle is over, nobody's naive, but it does remind us that predictions are folly, that, you know, trying to predict in some, you know, exact way where a society going isn't really important or possible. We should think about the likely trajectory, and we have to predict where we think things are going to try and fashion policy to head off the worst and trying to create a better world. But, you know, I remember Noam Chomsky, the great American dissident, whenever he was asked about predicting things, he said, listen, this isn't a matter of prediction, it's a matter of action. Right? We make a world by acting, not by predicting what will happen. And I've carried that with me for a long time now, that prediction is fine. Sometimes we have to try and give it our best shot. But the real question is action. What do we want to do?
I just want to say thank you so much for all the work that you do and for this beautiful book that not only challenges us to see the limits of our knowledge, but to really be open to what we don't know.
Yeah. Well, Sylvia, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And there's a new pleasure now because since we last talked, I've moved, and the community I now live in, the community radio station there carries Latin waves, so I get to hear you on my radio, not just having to go online. It's never as much fun to go online. So there's a little thing to celebrate in my life. I get to hear you on the radio where I live. So keep up the good work, please.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Look
bet.
forward to speaking to you again. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to Latin Waves. Latin Waves is an independently produced syndicated radio program made available for free to campus and community radios, and also to the world at latinwavesmedia.com. Please visit the website to hear previous shows, hear about upcoming events, and consider becoming a member for as little as $1 per month.